How did Orthodoxy start? The Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches officially broke communion in the High Middle Ages. The two sides had had theological disputes for centuries, but now it was also a matter of politics. The Western papal authority, for instance, was a thorn in the side of the Eastern Orthodoxy. The ambitions of the Roman Patriarchate eventually led to the breakdown in communication and eventually the East-West schism. But how did we get to this? How did the Orthodox traditions differ from the Catholic ones? And most importantly, how did Orthodoxy start? Let's dive into the rich history of this tradition. 50 days after the resurrection, the Holy Spirit descended on the apostles. Known as Pentecost, this event is usually termed the birth of the Christian Church. It is one of the biggest feasts in the Orthodox tradition, which values the apostolic teachings dearly and insists on apostolic succession. As the apostles traveled through the Roman Empire, Christianity continued to spread through the eastern parts. Despite persecution, cities like Jerusalem and Antioch gave birth to devoted communities, followed by fraternities in Rome, Greece, and Byzantium, later Constantinople and now Istanbul. Initially, local churches in various cities looked to Jerusalem as a point of reference, since it was the site of Jesus' crucifixion. When Constantine converted to Christianity in 313, things began to change and the imperial forces helped give shape to the church's institutions. The biggest example of this was the affirmation of the 5 Sees, all of which adhered to a hierarchy of eminence. The First Council of Nicaea, the first of the ecumenical councils, recognized the sees of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch in 325. These 3 patriarchates were largely understood to take precedence over other institutions of the Church, with Rome being the most important. In 381, the First Council of Constantinople invited the See of Constantinople into the fold. The See of Jerusalem completed the Pentarchy with the Council of Chalcedon in 451. It also elevated Constantinople above Alexandria and Antioch, moving it into the 2nd place. There were a lot disgruntled voices involved at this council, and the Church of Alexandria even broke off. It is important to note that these 5 patriarchates are distinguished since they trace their lineage back to Andrew, Mark, Peter, Paul, and James. The Roman acceptance of the religion had opened new doors for Christianity, and over the next few centuries, the religion continued to grow around the world. From the 5th century onward, Constantinople was considered the cradle of the Orthodox Christian civilization. While some churches were thriving, others were falling by the wayside. The Patriarchate of Alexandria had already separated itself as the Alexandrian Coptic Church, and the Patriarchates of Antioch and Jerusalem fell at the hands of the rising Muslims. The Pentarchy was effectively done and dusted. The only 2 remaining and flourishing of the 5 sacred sees, Rome and Constantinople, became bastions of Christianity, effectively giving rise to a dichotomy. The Western churches under the authority of Rome used Latin, whereas the Eastern churches under the other 4 patriarchs used Greek. This caused a linguistic divide that created problems concerning doctrinal interpretations. And it wasn't just the language, but the culture as well. The Hagia Sophia and other monuments built by Justinian in the 6th century helped nourish the Orthodox faith, including its theological ideas, art, and iconography. As both sides developed distinct personalities which affected how they dealt with religion, minor issues started popping up. However, there was a way to resolve these issues. Over the course of multiple centuries, several ecumenical councils were called to discuss theological disputes. Different denominations of Christianity continue to debate and disagree on the decisions taken during these councils. The Orthodox churches are no different. The tradition accepts the first 7 ecumenical councils as valid and considers their ecclesiastical decisions crucial in shaping the Church. The 7th Ecumenical Council, or the Second Council of Nicaea, was called in the late 8th century. In other words, the major disagreements between the Latin and Eastern churches start to take root from this point onward. The Filioque controversy is a perfect example of this. Here is an important verse from the Gospel of John in chapter 15, verse 26. "But when the Comforter is come, whom I will send unto you from the Father, even the Spirit of truth, which proceedeth from the Father, he shall testify of me." It clearly states that the Spirit proceeds from the Father. Some Western or Latin churches began adding the words, "and from the Son," to the procession of the Holy Spirit. Promoted by some Western churches in the late 8th century, this addition became a point of contention since it went against the 500 years tradition of the Church. It was not officially adopted by the Western churches right away, but we'll circle back to that in a moment. There were other differences as well, like the issue of unleavened versus leavened bread for the Eucharist, or the inclusion of married priests. With increasing political disparity, these seemingly minor divergences kept accentuating. Let's look at the political landscape from the Church's perspective. The emerging Western kingdoms in the wake of the Western Roman Empire developed a rivalry with the Eastern Roman Empire. Charlemagne's coronation in Rome, in which the Roman Pope crowned him the Emperor of the Romans, was particularly aggressive. Christianity was undeniably tied with the Roman Empire, and now the Pope's assertion that all Romans would be ruled by the Carolingian dynasty in the West was not taken kindly in the Byzantine Empire. While the Patriarch of Rome was reasserting his primacy as awarded by the councils, the Patriarch of Constantinople was also busy centralizing more power. The Eastern or Greek churches believed that Rome had primacy of honor awarded by a council of men, not a legitimate supremacy over all matters regarding Christianity. The thought of the Roman bishops, especially the Pope, overseeing every aspect of the church rubbed them the wrong way. By the 9th and 10th centuries, these disagreements had taken on a life of their own. The Eastern Patriarchates of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem were all resisting Roman centralization. A major issue in this regard was the Phocian Schism of the 9th century. The Byzantine Emperor Michael III deposed the Patriarch of Constantinople and appointed a new one named Photius. It was an imperial attempt at exercising more control on the church and making a statement. The Roman Patriarch refused to accept this action and demanded that the last Patriarch be reinstated. After the emperor died, his replacement reconciled with the Pope, deposed Photius, and reinstated the last Patriarch. Rome had had its way, but this series of events highlighted crucial underlying problems in the Church. In the 11th century, these squabbles came to a head when the Latin Church officially incorporated the Filioque clause into liturgical practice in 1014. In the mid-11th century, the Greek churches in southern Italy were being forced to conform to Latin practices, including the acceptance of Filioque. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael I Carolarius, ordered that all Latin churches in Constantinople be closed. Pope Leo IX sent 3 papal legates to Constantinople to force the Patriarch to submit to Roman authority, among other demands involving political support to deal with the Norman invasion of southern Italy. When the Byzantine Patriarch refused to bow down to the Pope, Western legates excommunicated him. Pope Leo had already passed away by the time the legates reached Michael, who in response excommunicated the legates. While it does seem possible that only Michael might have been excommunicated by the legates, or that he might have only excommunicated the legates in return, the breach was so firmly rooted in customs, doctrine, liturgy, and geography that it never healed. To put it simply, the Eastern churches had major issues on 2 accounts. One, the Filioque was an unnecessary addition to the Nicene Creed, undermining a fundamental theological concept. It further exacerbated the Western versus Eastern divide, which already had its fair share of liturgical and cultural arguments. And 2, the Western Church was making power moves to accumulate political capital for the seat of the Pope and undermining the Eastern churches. Despite attempts at reconciliation, the traditions grew apart over time. Over time, Western Catholicism has been painted as more liberal, whereas the Orthodoxy has been portrayed as the more rigorous. When we look at them together, we see that they never saw eye to eye on a ton of issues. Since it is Orthodox, the tradition follows the doctrine of Christ rather strictly, believing that any subsequent changes by councils or the Church are merely expansions or clarifications. Anything that goes beyond that is plain wrong. That includes the supreme powers granted to the Pope. The Eastern Orthodoxy believes that bishops are not infallible and should be considered equal, unlike Catholicism. Differences in customs like Eucharist withstanding, there are also a lot of underlying spiritual differences. The Orthodox theology focuses more on the resurrection of Jesus and how one can transcend into the divine, which is why it has a lot more ascetic components like monastic prayers and such. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Orthodoxy has never reconciled with the Western tradition. Now, the followers of the Eastern tradition would assert that they're carrying on the unchanged succession from the early days of the undivided Church. The Catholics and Protestants would disagree. It's up to you to think about it rationally and come to a conclusion yourself. And please let us know which side you end up on in the comments. Thanks for sticking around. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. That's it for now. See you in the next one. Bible Short Stories, signing off.